Hoş geldiniz. Biraz geç başladık, kusura bakmayın. Yağmurdan dolayı ve etraftaki otoparkların kapalı olmasından dolayı bazı dinleyicilerin yolda olduğunu öğrendik. Öncelikle çok teşekkür ederek başlamak istiyorum. Birkaç kuruma, kişiye. Öncelikle tabii ki Friedrich Ebert Stiftung Vakfı Türkiye temsilciliğine hem bu kitabın yayımlanmasındaki katkısından hem de bu tanıtım etkinliğinin düzenlenmesindeki desteklerinden dolayı çok teşekkürler. Bu tanıtım etkinliğine ev sahipliği yapan Hrant Dink Vakfı'na çok teşekkür ediyoruz. Biz Aras Yayıncılık olarak daha mütevazı bir etkinlik düşünürken sayelerinde çok daha geniş kapsamlı bir etkinliğe dönüşmüş oldu. Geldiğiniz için size çok teşekkür ederiz. Çünkü kitap yayımlamak özellikle bu tür etkinliklerle birleştiği zaman daha anlamlı oluyor. Kitaplarda açılan tartışmaların kamuoyunda paylaşılması, kamusallaşması, zenginleşmesi, derinleşmesi bakımından bu toplantıların çok önemli olduğunu düşünüyorum kitaplar hakkındaki. Bu basitçe kitabın tanıtımı değil, aslında bir fikir alışverişi, bir düşünce, kolektif düşünce pratiği diye de düşünebiliriz. Ve elbette davetimizi kabul ettikleri için Sayın Libaridian'a ve Barçın İnanç'a çok teşekkür ederiz. Tabii öncelikle Aras Yayıncılık adına böylesi değerli bir kitabı, böylesine anlamlı bir zamanda yayımlamaktan büyük bir mutluluk ve onur duyduğumuzu ifade etmek istiyorum. Ve kitabın çevirmenlerinden biri olarak da kitaptaki ufuk açıcı ve ilham verici makaleleri çevirme şansına eriştiğim için çok mutluyum. İzninizle İngilizce'de kendisine teşekkür etmek istiyorum. Thank you very much. Oh no. Zamanlama çok kötü. Just to thank you for a while in English. Thank you very much for accepting our invitation, Professor Libaridian. It's a great happiness to have you here. Also, on behalf of Aras Publishing, I would like to express our great pleasure and honor to publish such a valuable book at such a meaningful time. As one of the translators of the book, I'm very happy to have the chance to translate the enlightening and inspiring articles in the book. Thank you for coming and being with us. Thanks. Şimdi size kısaca bu etkinliğin nasıl ilerleyeceğini aktarmak isterim. Önce konuklarımızı takdim edeceğim kısaca ve kitap hakkında biraz bilgi vermeye çalışacağım yine kısaca. Ardından da sizleri davet edeceğiz sorular için ve cevapları Sayın Libaridian'dan alacağız. Sayın Libaridian'ı herkesin çok iyi tanıdığına eminim ama bir ihtimal bilmeyenler için ve aslında onu tanıtmak kendi başına tekrar çok güzel de bir şey olduğu için tekrar tanıtmak istiyorum. Bu yaptıklarını hatırlamanın önemli olduğunu düşünüyorum Libaridian'ın. Kendisi emekli tarihçi ve diplomat. Modern Ermeni tarihi ve çağdaş siyaset üzerine dersler verdi. Kitaplar ve makaleler yazdı. Zoryan Çağdaş Ermeni Araştırma ve Dokümentasyon Enstitüsü'nün kurucularından ve 1990'a kadar enstitünün müdürlüğünü yaptı. 1983-1988 arasında Armenian Review dergisinin editörlüğünü yürüttü. 1991-97 arasında Ermenistan Cumhurbaşkanı Levon Ter-Petrosyan'ın kıdemli danışmanı, Dışişleri Bakanı'nın baş yardımcısı ve Ulusal Güvenlik Konseyi Sekreteri olarak görev yaptı. 2001-2012 arasında Ann Arbor'daki Michigan Üniversitesi'nde Alex Manugyan Modern Ermeni Tarihi Kürsüsü'nde çalıştı. Çok sayıda eseri var. Bunları sayamayacağım. Bazılarını kitabın içindeki kısa biyografisinde de bulabilirsiniz ama eserleriyle düşünce biçimimizi ciddi biçimde etkilediğini söyleyebilirim. Barçın Hanım'ı da gene kısaca tanıtmak isterim. 30 yılı aşkın bir süreyi kapsayan basın kariyerine Ankara'da diplomasi muhabiri olarak başladı. Milliyet, TV8, CNN Türk, Referans ve Hürriyet Daily News'de çalıştı. Halen T24 dış politika analisti olarak çalışıyor. Yakın zamanda Ermenistan Başbakanı Nikol Paşinyan'la Ermenistan'da görüşen gazeteciler arasında yer aldı. Dış politika ve uluslararası ilişkiler konularındaki makaleleri Turkey in Depth ve Turkey Analyst gibi yayınlarda yer alıyor. Son makalesi Türkiye'de Kadın, Barış ve Güvenlik Ajandası, Diplomaside Kadın. Bunu özellikle zikretmek istedim. Çok önemli bir makale olduğunu başlığı itibariyle düşündüğüm için.
Akademik makale diyelim.
Peki.
Gazetecilik makalesi değil ama.
Evet. Aynı zamanda UNDP'de UN Women olmak üzere çok sayıda uluslararası örgütün düzenlediği panellerde moderatörlük yaptı ve pek çok düşünce kuruluşunun toplantılarında konuşmacı olarak yer aldı. Bugün de bizim toplantımızın moderatörlüğünü yapıyor. Çok teşekkürler tekrar. Ve kitap hakkında birkaç cümle söylemek isterim. Bu kitap 1978-2017 arasında Libaridian'ın yazdığı makalelerden, yaptığı konuşmalardan ve röportajlardan oluşuyor. Antares Yayıncılık tarafından 2021'de Yerevan'da Ermenistan-Türkiye Devlet, Tarih, Politika adıyla yayımlanan seçkinin bir çevirisi. Bazı makaleler yok. Seçkide yer alan bazı Ermenice makaleler bu kitapta yok. Editoryal tercih gereği diyebiliriz. Kitapta 16 tane makale var. Bir de bir Türkçe için ön söz var. Makalelerin 3'ü Ermeniceden çevrildi. Kalanları İngilizceden çevrildi. Kitap 5 bölümden oluşuyor. İlk bölüm Ermenistan ve Türkiye üzerine başlığını taşıyor. Ve burada özellikle Ermenistan'ın bağımsızlığından itibaren Türkiye, Ermenistan ve Türk-Ermeni ilişkilerinin incelendiğini ve Türkiye-Ermenistan müzakere sürecinin tartışıldığını görüyoruz. İkinci bölüm tarihi tasavvur etme meselesi. Çevirirken özellikle en çok zevk aldığım bölümlerden biri bu. Çünkü Ermeni soykırımını nasıl konuşmalıyız, nasıl tartışmalıyız, tarihsel bir vaka olarak nelere tekabül ediyor, bugün nelere işaret ediyor ve geçmişi bir hapishane olarak mı görmeliyiz yoksa gelecek için, geleceği yeniden şekillendirmek için bir veri mi? Ve Ermeni soykırım araştırmalarının geleceği nedir? Buna dair önemli tartışmalar var. Üçüncü bölüm Ermeni soykırımı tartışması. Burada ise Ermeni soykırımının tarih yazımı üzerine bir tartışma var. Bu da çok önemli. Aynı zamanda da dönemin Dışişleri Bakanı Davutoğlu'nun ve Erdoğan'ın Ermeni meselesine bakışıyla ilgili de eleştirel bir analiz var. Dördüncü bölüm soykırım anmalarının siyasi veçesi. 90. yıl ve 95. yıl dönümü münasebetiyle Sayın Libaridian'ın bazı gazetelere verdiği röportajlardan oluşuyor. Bu da çok ilham verici bir bölüm. Yani bir soykırımı nasıl anmalıyız üzerine yaratıcı fikirlere sürüklendiğiniz yazılar, öyle söyleyebilirim. Son bölüm köprüler. Bu bölümde sadece bir makale var. Başlığı da Hrant'ın inşa ettiği köprüler. Bunun çok bir bölümünün sadece bir makaleden oluşmasını ve bunun da Hrant Dink'in inşa ettiği köprülere ayrılmasını başlı başına çok anlamlı buluyorum zaten. Bugün de bu köprülerin Hrant Dink Vakfı tarafından sürekli inşa edildiğini görüyoruz. Bu da çok mutluluk verici, onur verici bir durum bence. Son olarak kitabın girişindeki ilk paragrafı okumak istiyorum izninizle. Çünkü bu paragrafın kitabın meramını anlattığını düşünüyorum. Sonra da sözü size vereceğim. Barçın Hanım'a. Okur bu kitapta Ermeni-Türk ve Ermenistan-Türkiye ilişkilerinin tarihinden kesitler, bu tarihe yönelik argümanlar bulacak. Okurun kitapta bulacağı bir diğer şey ise yazarı psikoloji ve sosyoloji alanlarından ödünç kavramlar kullanmaya mecbur bırakan konuya ilişkin politikanın ve politik aklın çözümlemesi olacak. Dolayısıyla kitapta bilhassa Ermeni toplumuna ve devletine yönelik can alıcı sorular ve bunlardan doğan kaygılar mevcut. Kitapta tarihin ve siyasetin yarattığı karmaşıklıkları anlama çabası önemli yer tutuyor. Söz konusu çabanın amacıysa karmaşık durumlardan doğan hislerin ve düşüncelerin bitmek bilmeyen çarpışmasından rasyonel bir tarih anlatısı çıkarmak. Bunu başarmak için mutlak surette doğru soruları sormak gerekiyor. Zira başka yerlerde de belirttiğim üzere yanlış sorunun doğru cevabı olmaz. Fakat doğru sorunun yanlış cevabı dahi yararlı olabilir. Kitap tam da bunları yapıyor ve bunları yapmamıza vesile oluyor diye düşünüyorum. ufuk açıcı, ilham verici bir bakış açısı kazandırarak düşünceyi kışkırtıyor ve doğru sorular sormamıza imkan sağlıyor. O doğru sorulardan bazılarının Barçın Hanım tarafından bugün kendisine zaten az sonra iletileceğini düşünüyorum. Sonrasında sizlerle devam edeceğiz. Dolayısıyla sözü kendisine bırakıyorum Barçın Hanım. Buyurun.
Teşekkürler. Biz İngilizce devam edeceğiz diye biliyorum. I have to say this is a huge privilege for me to be part of this exercise because I started journalism in 1990 as an intern and full-time in 1991 in Ankara as a diplomatic reporter. And therefore I had gained the opportunity of sort of witnessing the relations between Turkey and Armenia after the dissolution of Soviet Union. And at that time, sometimes Mr. Libaridian used to come secretly to Turkey, and I was supposed to learn about it actually. And when it would be revealed that he's Turkey, then I was supposed to, chase him and try to understand what they are talking about it. That's why, to me, I was very, very happy when they offered to be with him today in this podium, and I very much enjoyed his book. Actually, in 1993, I went to Armenia for the first time, and as Nesrin has said, I was among the journalists who interviewed Pashinyan last month. So, in the course of these 30 years, I haven't been to Armenia, but I've tried to follow Turkish-Armenian relations. And in fact, last week I was in Brussels with again talking about Turkish-Armenian relations with a group of journalists, analysts. Some of them are actually in this room. And at one stage, I was talking to one Armenian former parliamentarian and young academic, saying this year is my sort of Turkish-Armenia year because I've been to Armenia, now I'm here, and next week I will be talking about the book of Professor Libaridian. And he told me, he said, actually I read his book and it made me change some of my ideas, he said. I was more radical, but it really helped me change my perspective. So I thought you might want to know about this anecdote. But to me, one of the interesting aspects of a book is when you come around something that you say, I didn't know this perspective. I didn't know about this information. And so I would like to start by this concept and probably ask him to answer as a historian. And then I will go perhaps more to Armenia, Turkey-Armenia relations, etc. But the concept of this genocide as an ultimate repression and the concept of political genocide that you will come across the book. Because for us, the Turks, usually the narrative is, what happened to Armenians has not happened in a vacuum. Armenians have uprising, they were armed struggle, and it was World War I. They joined with the Russians, so that's why they were supposed to be exiled, etc. Whereas you, in my view, at least for my perspective, you underline something important in the sense that Armenians were not actually asking for independence, but actually they were asking for reform, and in that sense they were being targeted by the rulers of that time. Would you like to talk about it a little bit without giving a big spoiler, of course?
Yes. First I want to thank Aras Publishing and Nesrin especially, both the translator and then actual producer and all the workers at Aras, and also Gerard Dink and all the workers at the Hrant Dink Foundation for working together with Aras in order to produce these two events today. But of course, the book that you see, I should say that this is my 6th book in 5 years. 3 of them in Armenian, 2 in English, and 1 in Turkish. And so I expect that you will not read anything else in the next year. Expect. Anyway, and I also thank Burcu Barçın for being here and accepting the invitation to discuss the book. One other comment before I get, with your permission. My whole life, beginning from age 8, learning tavlu from my grandfather from Urfa, who was an Ottoman soldier, and who would stop before he threw his dushesh. He would tell me stories. And then his friends, the Urfalas, would come on Saturday, and they'd talk and repeat the stories over and over again, just, I guess, to convince themselves that it really happened. But there were stories that had no explanation. We also had Armenian history courses where there were so many things I could not understand. And it may be possible to explain my whole life as a search for the answers to these questions. Why did it happen? And what does it mean that it happened? And all the myths and the mythology that Armenians had built around their history. I found out that most of the history I know was not history. It was martyrology, victimology, and history is something else. It has to be more critical. And I came to the conclusion that looking at the last 30 years, to understand Armenia, the fundamental issue is the clash between 2 visions of Armenia. One vision is the one of the victim, not just of the past, but also the victim of the future, and to be victimized again by Turkey, which means that you need a protector, and that protector is most likely Russia, and then it's worth giving your independence to Russia or the Soviet Union. In this respect, it's all the same. You give your independence, but also you give the freedom to choose your regime, because Russia needs its own regime in Armenia if we're going to be faithful to Russia. This is one vision. And it continues today to underlie all the opposition to Pashinyan. The other vision is that, and of course the first vision always requires a savior, a protector. The other vision is that history has not given us a real protector. We haven't had, and we cannot be part of the region if we consider ourselves something that survives because of Russia or Europe or France or whatever. That is, we need to learn from history a different lesson than having been a victim, different lesson that says we also participated in the making of our history, and that if we're going to have an independent country, it will have to be integrated in the region, which means to solve all the problems with our neighbors. And the best security will be that we have minimized or eliminated our problems with our neighbors. So I start from here. And this may answer some of the questions that will come later. Coming to the question of the interpretation of the genocide, Burcu explained, let's say, the Turkish saying security and whatever, or separatist movement. And Armenia is explained by as clash of nationalisms, as 2 peoples against each other, religious, and land competition, who owns the land, etc. There may, first, I don't believe that fundamentally it is religious. Religion was used to justify, ethnicity was used to justify, but its justification is different than causation. And at some point in the 80s, I started asking myself the question, if I'm going to explain as a historian, I have a duty to see how did the leaders of the Turkish government responsible for that policy, what did they see when they looked at an Armenian leader? What did they see when they thought of Armenians? Differences of language, religion were not that important. The leaders were not that religious anyway, although they used religion, as I said. And that led me to see, to start paying more attention to the relations between Armenian leaders and the Turkish leaders. And I started realizing that fundamentally the leadership of the Armenian people had changed from religious, the patriarch and the institution of the patriarchy, to the political parties. This was fundamental. So they were negotiating with the Tashnak Sütyun and to some extent with the Hınçagyans, although the Tashnak Sütyun was the more relevant one. And I came across some documents that described the negotiations after the Young Turk Revolution between the Tashnaks and the Young Turks, İttihat ve Terakki Cemaisi. And in those notes, there were the positions of the two, and the Young Turks, the İttihat, asking, what do you guys want? And Tashnak Sütyun making a list of things. And at the end, the İttihat saying, look, this is too long a list, it's too much you're asking. What is the bottom line? The one thing that you want and the only one thing. And the answer from the Tashnak Sütyun was agrarian reform. Because what was historical Armenia, the West history, was being emptied because of the agrarian crisis. There was also other issues, but the agrarian crisis was the most important. And in terms of asking for reforms in general, parliamentarianism, democracy, representation of ethnic groups in parliament where you solve your problems, the most important was the agrarian reform that Armenia needed. And the Tashnak Sütyun said, the whole empire needs it, but if you're not ready to do it for the whole empire, do it in the areas where Armenians live. Now, what does this mean? The liberal wing of the Young Turks had been eliminated. I will not go into how and why, but the hardliners had taken over, and they had moved toward a more reactionary, state-oriented policies. And for a group of group of their people to demand something that was radical at the time. Agrarian reform, every country does it, but at the time it would have been radical. That placed the Armenians in the leftmost wing of the Ottoman political spectrum. And this, as you indicated, makes a difference. That is, you no longer look at Armenia, Turkey as two opposites to begin with, but an integrated history. That is, the Armenian issue is an integral part of Ottoman politics and Ottoman history. This is the big difference. And when they're looking at Armenians, these leaders, these are not just a political elite. The Tashnaks and Hınçaks had been waging guerrilla warfare and expanding into the grassroots in the villages, as opposed to the Young Turk Revolution that was from the top and remained at the top. So the Armenian was a radical element that pushed for parliamentarianism when the Ittihad was pushing for the superiority of the state and anything to make the state survive. The Ittihad was answering one question: what do we make to make the state survive? Armenians were asking, what do we do to have the people survive? So my interpretation of the genocide brought this dimension, political genocide, as opposed to, let's say, the Holocaust that was purely racist. The Turkish attitude toward Armenians was not racist. There was an element of ethnic superiority, religious superiority, but during the deportations and massacres, they took Armenian kids with Armenian blood, so to speak, Armenian girls, and made them their wives, so they were not afraid to mix blood as the Germans were. So this was more of a political. And one final comment. Yeah, most genocides in history have been political genocide, not racial genocides. The Nigerian genocide, the Cambodian genocide, the Indonesian genocide, many that are forgotten now, they're political. They solve political problems as seen by the rulers of the time. So this is my the fundamental concept with regard to that issue of what was genocide for.
Right. So, so from your articles, I understand that the more, for instance, Ittihad and Terakki has turned authoritarian and towards despotism, the more Armenians who were asking for reform became targets, not because they were Armenian or speaking Armenian or they were Christian, but because they were asking something else and they were sort of objecting to what. So that to me that was an interesting perspective. Another theme that appears in your book, and you have started to talk about it a little bit, but let's also again touch upon it because it is important even for today, the fear strategy. Tell us about how you talk about the fear strategy. Maybe you might elaborate further what you have just recently said in your introductory remarks, how that has come to define especially the foreign policy of Armenia, made it dependent on third countries.
This relates to how do we see the genocide today. If you see it as a historical event that can be explained by the circumstances of that period, a political event, then that event belongs to that particular period. But if you start explaining genocide as something that is characteristic to Turks, and Turks are Turks today as they were then, this is the logic, it's not my position, and that if they're not recognizing genocide, that's already added proof that they, if we become independent, then they'll come and finish the genocide by massacring people of Armenia. I'm not making up this argument. This argument was made. Among the best argument was done by the Tashnaks themselves. At the time when Armenia was trying to decide whether to be independent or not, arguing that we cannot be independent because we will be massacred. Now, you see, strategy, the word strategy comes in. You're afraid of something, but if you're in politics and you're making history, you start wondering, why are you afraid? How real is that fear? And what can you do to deal with that fear? But here in the Armenian case, in this particular issue, the point is that fear itself becomes a strategy. We're afraid, therefore we cannot do this. We cannot have independence. That is, there are no intermediary explanations. The fear is the most legitimate thing. The fear is the most important thing. And that fear means that you need a protector, going back to my introductory remarks. So the strategy of fear becomes the critical one in strengthening the first vision and the opposition to. And that explains today the opposition to, let's say, Pashinyan, who's gotten away from that traditional 200-year-old idea that you need a protector, and that you need to give up your independence in order to be protected, and you need a savior. And I do not use the term savior very lightly, because savior is a biblical term. It's a religious concept. And well, I'll stop here because it will go too far. But the fear concept is that we can't do it till now. Although, to end this answer, the 2020 war, where Russia did nothing to help the Karapakhsis, where Russia did nothing when the ethnic cleansing was happening, Russia did nothing when Lachin was blocked for months, and at the end, Russia did nothing. It supported practically Azerbaijan without practically, I mean, giving anything, but doing nothing. And a lot of Armenians in Armenia start thinking, maybe they're not our protectors. And this has shaken Armenian politics, and particularly with the younger ones who do not have that old Soviet era sense that it's taken for granted that we need Russia.
Thank you. Actually, the fear strategy works for other countries as well. You know, as much as there is the fear of the Armenian from the Turks, there is also this fear of Turkey from the others, where you also talk about it actually in your book, and you touch upon it as the famous Sevr syndrome, right? We also, in Turkey as well, the state has many times has used the fear strategy, and even today perhaps they continue to use the fear strategy. In fact, in part of your book, you also touch upon, you know, the Kurdish question, etc. But again, we don't want to give too much of a spoiler, and in order to give the floor to the audience, let me perhaps shift a little bit to one anecdote that was also striking for me. But yes, go ahead.
Something about that Sevr syndrome. Just an anecdote. In 2000, a Greek foundation that had a fund at Harvard University organized a conference on the future of Turkish foreign policy. And it was a good conference, and the most interesting part was the luncheon, where former Foreign Minister of Turkey, Sosyal, made an excellent presentation of what to expect and what are the factors that impact Turkish foreign policy. And I was very impressed. And then the last point was about the Sevr syndrome. Now, I was invited to attend, but I realized that the invitation was because Mr. Alaton was there. Itzhak Alaton. And I knew of him, I guess he knew of me, but we'd never met. And as soon as I walked in, he came and said, "Gel buraya." So he put me next to him on the table. So we're listening to Soysal together. And when this wonderful speech ended with this, what was the Sevr syndrome, the syndrome that Turkey has used, that Turkey is always in danger to be divided up by Europeans, by imperialists. Well, which had, excuse me, truth in history, but that's how they saw Armenians, how they saw Kurds, and justified their policies on these fears. And Soysal said this is the most important thing in our policy, and they teach this to us in schools, in primary schools. And this is the best thing that is done. And my eyes open, which doesn't happen very often, and I'm going, he said, otur, otur. Alaton said, he's going to take care of it. And then he raised his hand, and he said, Mr. Minister, excellent speech. I am Itzhak Alaton, I'm 74 years old. I have everything anyone could want in life. I've had only one regret, that I never went to school. And he said, now I'm so happy I didn't go to school.
You will you will find many anecdotes like that in the book. And again, another anecdote that I would like to talk a little bit and bring the subject to today, perhaps, is that I think in 2000 or something like that, there's a meeting between Turkish, Azerbaijan, Armenian, and American think tankers, let's say, academics, think tankers, on the possibility of Turkish-Armenian reconciliation. And the question is, can it happen in the absence of a solution to Nagorno-Karabakh? And there are 25 to 30 person, I mean, I don't remember the detail, but 4 persons come out and say, no, there cannot be Turkish-Armenian reconciliation if there is not a solution to Nagorno-Karabakh problem. Guess who was one of the people who said that? It was Professor Libaridian. And I guess today, when you look back, when you look to the current situation, you must say I was right.
Unfortunately, yes. It's not feeling to be right about a failure. This was a joint, one-day closed workshop for the Security Council and Department of State of the US. Security Council people were saying, no, we don't think without Karabakh resolution there could be a solution. And State Department, very wishful thinking, deciding that yes, it can be. So they invited experts. The experts were, I think, 13 or 14 people. And 2 of those who said no, I was one, and the other was Tofik Zulfukarov, the former foreign minister of Azerbaijan. I think we knew, but the others were very hopeful, and it reminds me of a sentence that the American writer Saul Bellow states: so much intelligence can be invested in ignorance when the illusion of the need for illusion is so great.
One of the interesting anecdotes that I have from our interview with Mr. Pashinyan was his approach to diaspora, and to also to the fact that whether genocide is recognized by third countries, you know, he said, you know, as you have just said in your introductory remark, that for us what is important is to have a good relationship with our neighbors. Whether a very far away country like Brazil recognizes it, I mean, thank you very much, you know, I'm not going to say no, but it doesn't help me so much. On the contrary, maybe it doesn't help my relationship with the neighbors, and I am assuming that he might not be so popular in the diaspora. And in your book as well, you are touching upon the diaspora as well. What would you like to say about the approach of diaspora in the course of the last, I don't know, of your lifetime, let's say? Have you seen a change? Are they staying where they are? What would you say?
Well, let me begin, Barchan, with has there been change? I think yes. The change has been quiet. It's not the kind of change that you see. The change has been since President Biden said it's genocide. And nothing really changed in people's lives, in politics. So people started saying, well, we lived all our lives to have this kind of statement, and then nothing real changed. So I'll begin from there. The diaspora is trying to solve a different problem than Armenia. First of all, diaspora is a very different category of thing than a state. Diaspora has no borders. Diasporan Armenians do not rely on anything Armenian for their security, for the development, economic development, on things Armenian. It's a volunteer activity to keep language and history, and a state is different. Good or bad regime, good or bad president, it's a state has responsibility for the borders, for the security of its people, for the welfare of its people. And it's an Armenian state. So the two entities, when they say diaspora Armenian, they are, oranges and apples. They do not mix. The second level of this is the primary concern is the identity of the Armenian in diaspora. How do we keep our identity? I've been living in the United States, except years in Yerevan, and since 1964. Most of you were not born then. I've been living there, and every generation asks the question, who am I? What is an Armenian? No Armenian in Armenia asks that question. And then every activity is related to their trying to find an identity. A little more language, a little more music, certainly more food, and dance in the United States. Armenian dance is very important, as opposed to Armenians in the Middle East, for example. But it's a question of building identity, finding identity. And over the years, for different reasons, knowing about the genocide and genocide recognition became the most important criterion for identity. If you stop an Armenian in Los Angeles or Boston and say, what is an Armenian? And he'll tell you, or she'll tell you, two things: first Christian nation and first genocide of the 20th century. This is not a kind of mentality that solves state-level war-peace problems. Now, if your concern is identity, and genocide recognition is top of the agenda in order to do that, it's fine. But along with that comes the politicization of the genocide in a way that says that's the beginning of demand of reparations from Turkey, territorial, financial, whatever. So what this sustains is this vision of a great Armenia that includes the eastern provinces of Turkey as Western Armenia, that includes Karapal, that includes Nakhchivan, Javakheti, and who knows what else. But the state of Armenia cannot do that. The Armenian state has responsibility for a certain amount of territory and people living on it. The diaspora in general, having this vague notion of reparations and demands, and from minimum recognition to territorial demands, they expected the Armenian state to do it. the Armenian state as the first step toward acquisition of other territories. Now, this is of course illusion, but it's not illusion when you expect and you decide to assess a president of Armenia or a prime minister on whether that person is saying, yes, we somehow, one way or another, that this is a good expectation, or yeah, we have demands. As our administration never said that. We made it very clear that we're just the government of Armenia and not the government of Greater Armenia, nor a weapon to create Greater Armenia. And the security we find the best is the security when you solve your problems with your neighbors. And this is the big conflict. And I should say that quite a bit has changed in the diaspora, number one. And number two, many people have understood that this conflict is a different kind of conflict than they want. And the idea that you expect the government of Armenia that has its problems already, and you want them to act according to your dreams, then the opposition is very clear. And that opposition is also supported by the internal opposition. One important fact, if Pashinyan, let's say, doesn't succeed, then the opposition, an opposite policy will come in that will revert to the idea of a foreign defender, a savior. In which case, neither our government nor Pashinyan's government will be the government. Then you will have people who accept that, and they'll become the government. And now reverse engineering, if I want to be the government instead of Pashinyan, then I'll support the other vision and Russia as the defender and the savior.
To pick it up from there, actually there is a part called in your book the future of the Armenian genocide research, and specifically there as well you are talking about how the recognition of genocide by third parties should not be the focus of all the efforts, that it should just downgrade Armenians to just a victim status. That's what you claim to say. And interestingly, Mr. Trump, for instance, he has avoided using the G word, which has shown us that actually this is being used as a political tool. Most probably Mr. Trump did not use it because he wanted to perhaps please Ankara. But in that chapter, when you talk about the future of the research, it was important to me, and I found it very courageous, if I may say humbly, that you also say that Armenian researchers should also not ignore human rights violations done by Armenians for Armenian interests against Azerbaijanis. That also I thought was quite courageous. In the book, you also say that an institute should be established in order to sort of depict if there could be signs of an upcoming sort of a genocide, and that sort of have I understood wrongly, that you know you can look ahead and maybe see. Have I misunderstood that? That's the establishment of the this institute.
The institute would not be looking for have from is that if we think genocide recognition is important, should be important for everyone because it's a crime against humanity, then we should care about other genocides. We should care about other repressions. And then the gift that we could assemble to give to the world in order to honor the memory of the victims of the genocide would be to try and predict and help prevent other genocides anywhere, in Africa, in Asia, and whatever.
Sorry about that. Çok pardon. Yes, because I thought that in the past it must have been easier to commit crimes against humanity because there were no televisions, nothing, etc. Whereas sometimes we watched live, crimes against humanity, and I have particularly what's going on in Gaza nowadays. It doesn't matter even if we watch it live, but before tossing the ball to the audience, can I also have a few words about your last paragraphs on how you've seen the mission of Hrant Dink as a bridge? Because he was also my colleague. In Turkish, we would say, gazeteci abimizdi. So if you may also talk a little bit about him, and then we will go on with the audience, please.
Yes, the Hrant Dink I knew, I think, well enough and read him to be able to speak as to what he represents, and that is he tried to transcend a number of limitations. Here's the question. If Armenians are a religious community, then you're defined by that religion, and traditional definition is conservative, protective, defensive. But if you're going to be a political community, what kind of political community are you going to be? And Hrant built bridges from where he started to other minorities in Turkey, to the Turkish majority, bridges to the world through values that were basically human values, through his interpretation of what democracy is and how much it is needed through democracy. So that chapter is, in fact, the introduction to Tuba Chandar's book on Hrant Dink, the English translation. I wrote that introduction, and I thought Hrant Dink was almost like a prophet, setting new agenda, new value systems, that we cannot consider ourselves victims of of a crime against humanity and treat others the way we were treated. If not killing others, but having sense of superiority, not sharing the humanity of others no matter what. And this is important because although we represent ourselves as Armenians as victims, but we also easily sometimes overcome that sense by creating a sense of superiority over others. In the Middle East, over Arabs. In the US, over Mexicans, the Hispanic, the Asians. So it's over the Native Americans, with whom I feel extremely close, and I've worked with them in my time in college. I was a member of the Black Students Union. The only non-black who was a member of the Black Students Union, and I was working for civil rights. And you know what? My black friends came with me to a vigil every year on April 24. It was mutual recognition. So from victim, we become victimizers. When Armenians went to Fresno, mostly from Harpert, Van, Erzincan, Erzurum, Bitlis, before the war, they started in the year 1900. The first family was Seropian, Harpertsi. And then others came. They started working in the fields, and they were despised and regarded as dogs. Armenians, until the 1950s, 60s, could not become teachers in schools in Fresno. Until the 1950s, 60s, in the town of Yorba Linda in Southern California, shops had signs, no Armenians or dogs. And what do you see when you go there now to Fresno? You see Armenian landowners mistreating Hispanic field workers, underpaying. So it's a different world as an Armenian. Then defining yourself in this limited way, and Hrant was one of the first, I should say, but the first to fully articulate this different Armenian than anyone else I know. I know Charles Garabed, an American-born Armenian lawyer in Northern California, who defended the revolutionary Black Panthers of America. And Armenians didn't want to talk to him. He was the most famous lawyer, political case lawyers. There was one Armenian who was the main promoter of black jazz. He produced records and, not important for Armenians. But you become Kim Kardashian and you show your whatever and then you're a great hero. It's not the way to go.
Çok teşekkürler bu harika sohbet için. Şimdi sözü dinleyicilere vereceğiz ve oldukça vaktimiz var. O yüzden şöyle güzel, rahat sohbet edelim, değil mi? Soruları alalım. Her zaman Libaridian'ı bulamayız. Buyurun. Evet. Nasıl yapalım? Tek tek mi alalım soruları? Nasıl istersiniz? Yoksa hepsini alalım, sonra hepsine mi cevap vermek istersiniz? Sayın Libaridian. You want? One by one. Okay. Buyurun.
First of all, thank you for being here. It was a great pleasure for us. When I was in university, in exams, they were asking for a traitor in history lessons. The right answer for traitor. And the right answer was always the Armenians. I was saying to my friends, don't be in doubt. The answer was always that. Is it the same in Armenia also? Are they teaching genocide in lessons? Is it this hate policy is there in books? Thank you.
Yes, they teach it. There was a question as when do you start teaching it? And in our time, Ashot Bleyan was Minister of Education, and he said that it shouldn't start at first grade, it should start at a time when kids can absorb that. And he was called a traitor. And of course, as traitors go, I am the best traitor for Armenians, right? I was selling garapa. Apparently, I was not a good salesman because I couldn't sell garapa in my time, but others did. Yes, they do. They teach it, but the difference is the following. For example, until a little after independence, April 24th, you know that there's a big, very moving monument in Armenia on the genocide. For years during the Soviet period, hundreds of thousands would start walking up the hill, visit, deposit a flower, and come down. Not a single word, not a single speech. Just respect. Then diaspora organizations came and started with flags and down with the Turks and down and burning Turkish flags and whatever. You know, it's changed. It became a slogan. Now, Beleyan did not want, and he was absolutely right. And this is a very important problem. Our daughter was born in Tacoma, Washington, but grew up in Cambridge, Massachusetts. And we did not discuss, unless academically or otherwise, but we never talked to her about genocide. We thought she'll grow up and whatever. But then we sent her at 7 years old to a Tashnak summer camp. 4 days later, she called crying, and she said, "The Turks killed us." And I went and brought her home, you know? If that's what we're gonna do with our children, I'd rather her not know about it than traumatize her at age 7 when she cannot manage. So there's a big question. But I can tell you this. After our period, the Tashnaks became part of the cabinet of Kocharyan and then Sej, and they had the Ministry of Education, and they created disaster after disaster. You should look at the textbooks. Textbooks are horrible. Not just saying this is what happened then because, but talking about, you know, to instill fear in you and anger and hatred, that there's no other result. So yes, it happens, and Pashinyan will want to change, but it's not that easy. It's not that easy because it takes time to produce new books. It takes time, even when the textbook is okay, the teachers are still the same. And some teachers will not teach from the book, they will teach from what they know. And what they know is worse than what they don't know. It's more dangerous what they know.
Başka soru alabiliriz.
Soru soranlar kendini de bir tanıtabilir mi diye bir rica geldi,
Tamam.
mümkünse.
Thank you very much, Mr. Libaridian, for this wonderful explanation. Okay, let me introduce myself. I'm Albert Keşiş. I'm a lecturer at university. And my question is this. You know, Erdogan's government, or Erdogan himself, assumed a different line towards Armenia or Armenian history or Armenian genocide. For over 10 years, if I'm not mistaken, Erdogan remembers the 24th of April, you know? So how do you evaluate Erdogan's government, this attitude, or is it inspiring hope for the future? So this is my question. Thank you.
Because there is also a chapter in the book about Mr. Erdogan's position, but thank you very much for the question. Yes.
It's a very important question, and it's important because it reveals certain things about Turkish political culture and the roots of the beliefs of leaders. Let me see if I can do this the right way. Erdogan's political roots are in Islam. And the genocide has little to do with Islam. The leaders were nationalists, right-wing nationalists who committed the crime. And I was not surprised, although I appreciated deeply when he did it the first time, and he did it last month. So fundamentally, I'm very appreciative of that. But the difference is that the nationalists cannot do that because their roots are the Young Turks. Erdogan's roots are the Sultanate, and Islam is the foundation of the empire. So the Ottoman heritage is more important for Erdogan than the nationalist heritage. So in a way, he's saving Islam. But he's not free of the traditional Turkish policy. And the article in my book does something else, explains this, but explains something else. I took every example where Erdogan used the term genocide in other cases. None of them reached the level of what happened to Armenians. And arguments are all the same when you want to justify or whatever. And then once he said at some point about, I think, one of the Balkan cases, that Islam governments don't commit genocide. So by definition, he could not call it genocide. But he recognized that there was something important enough to mention April 24th. But it's also not true. Look at Sudan, you know. The Sudan genocide is a Muslim government. But whether they do it because they're Muslim, I doubt. You know, Islam can be used, but whether the governments do it because of power, because of political issues they cannot resolve, or they don't want to resolve, they don't want to share power, they want to make more money, less money, or whatever. But when it happens, we have to be careful as to what we assign, what cause we assign, what characteristic we assign to those who commit such crimes.
Thank you for your speech. I am Büşra. I am PhD student in Marmara University, and my main topic is about Levantar-Petrosyan era, especially the friendship relationships. So I'm curious. Sorry? Friendship relationship. Friendship between Turkey and Armenia. So I'm curious about that. What was the closest moment, friendship establishment relationships between Armenia and Turkey? During your time.
It was February, March 1993. When we had, just to keep it short, when I was negotiating a protocol for the establishment of more normal relations and opening of the border. Negotiations, I think I came 4 times to Ankara. We worked out a protocol. There was 1 sentence left, and there was
That's the time when I'm rushing after these guys, trying to understand what's going on.
Yeah, and we're trying to get away. Well, Turkish journalism was aggressive.
Once upon a time.
Yeah, and it was. I mean, they wouldn't leave you alone. They knew when you were coming. They were at the airport. They were at the hotel. There, you know.
Sorry.
Yeah, it's okay. No. So anyway, we did a protocol, and the 4th time I left Ankara with the Secretary General of my colleague interlocutor and I reported to the Secretary General saying this is where we are, 1 sentence, whether to include or not to include, and then I offered a compromise solution. The Secretary General said that's something we'll think about, and I expected that within a couple of months we would sign a protocol and open diplomatic relations, and that was the Turkish intent too. And then in April of 1993, the Armenian forces in the Karabakh conflict that had taken Shusha and Lachin, Now they took Kelbajar, and the Turkish side stopped the negotiations. That was the closest in our time. Two comments. One, it didn't stop the contacts. We kept contact, discussions on issues. I came a few more times to Ankara, and there were Turkish diplomats who came unofficially, and we were able to open the Istanbul-Yerevan flights. We did a few other things. So things were kept from evolving into a crisis. This was the good. So, but the closest we came was during that period. I will also say that during the negotiations, Armenia did not have enough wheat to feed its people, ever. So always wheat came from Russia, but in this case, European Community at the time had donated 100,000 tons of wheat to Armenia that was coming through Abkhazia. And then the Abkhaz civil war started, and that was closed. We had no way of bringing wheat, and we asked the Turkish government. I discussed it with the foreign ministry, then the Bedrosian called Demirel, and Demirel immediately said yes. The wheat went to Trabzon, and Turkish trains brought it to Leninagan, to Gümri. And I think of the 100,000 tons, 52,000 were transferred that way over 2 months or a little more. And that saved Armenia from starvation. So there were issues with Karabakh. We were at war with Azerbaijan, but Turkey still looked at us because we also wanted to resolve the problem of Karabakh. So we did very well at that time, but then Turkey said, no, this is too much.
Can I ask a question? Were there conditions from the Turkish side? Because my understanding is that until the occupation of Kelbejar, until the deterioration of the war in Nagorno-Karabakh, my understanding from the book is that at the beginning there were some preconditions, like, you know, tell us that you will not work for the recognition of genocide, but then they dropped it.
Right.
Do I understand correctly that if there was not going to be Nagorno-Karabakh, it would have gone ahead, that they were not giving
it would
any...
have gone.
No. Because today, because later on, the Turkish side started to put some conditions like changing the constitution. Am I correct?
Well, you're correct in the sense that the first contacts between the Turkish government and the Armenian government were in 1991, when the Turkish ambassador in Moscow, Volkan Vural, came to Yerevan and talked with
he has a book out as well, by the way.
Well, I was not involved in 91. I was in Armenia, but I was a department head for the parliament. So I was not part of it, but what I've heard is that Ambassador Vural said, yeah, we're happy to do it, we want, but we want you to drop the genocide issue and convince the diaspora not to do it. And the Armenian leaders said, we cannot tell the diaspora what to do, they cannot tell us what to do. And genocide is part of our history, which is a different thing than making it a political issue. So after that, that issue did not come up. It came up indirectly the first time I came to Ankara and met with Candan Azer, the Turkish diplomat assigned to work with me. And during the first meeting, 3 hours, we just measured each other, like two cats, nothing serious. And then he asked if I wanted dinner with him, and we had dinner. And during that discussion, at some point, he said, you know, if we finish this bottle of Rakı, I know you're going to bring up the question of the genocide. And I said, what genocide? He said, what you guys call genocide. I said, I didn't call anything. We're just having good food, good Rakı. You know, you bring it up. You have a problem with it? Go and solve it. It's not mine. And that was the end of that discussion. I did not want to discuss the genocide with a Turkish diplomat whose government has a position. It's their position. But I'm not going to. He said, why don't you want to discuss? I said, look, you're a diplomat. You have a responsibility to the ministry and policy. Me, I'm an incidental diplomat. I'm a historian. I cannot discuss this thing with you because I know your position and mine is a historian's position. Yours is a diplomatic political position. So you want to, and that has been my answer to every Turkish ambassador or diplomat since then, whenever they want to discuss it.
But later on, the Turkish side
Wanted
changes to the constitution of Armenia, no?
That comes much later, and it's a very indirect way. That is, once the Kelbajar issue came up, then a precondition to continue negotiations was that solve the Karabakh issue, and then we'll do it. When the Karabakh issue was resolved at the expense of the Armenian side, then what became the Turkish foreign minister, I think Çavuşoğlu at the time, said something like, now that is resolved and now we can proceed with Armenia. But then Azerbaijan-Armenia negotiations on the bilateral issues came up, and when President Aliyev brought up the issue for constitutional change, then at times the Turkish government has also made that demand. Except that I can't remember, 3-4 months ago, the National Security Council of Turkey produced a statement saying that the peace agreement that has been agreed upon, the text, between Armenia and Azerbaijan should be signed and should be signed immediately without any precondition. There were no preconditions there, and this upset Baku very much. So Turkish policy in general, I could say, is basically Baku's decision. So Aliyev wants to keep as much pressure on Armenia as possible, and closing of the border, absence of relations is one of the tools they have used to keep pressure on Armenia.
Evet, salona dönelim mi tekrar?
Maybe to pick up on that issue, if I'm not mistaken, there is a declaration of independence of Armenia. And I think there is talk about Western Armenia, if I'm not mistaken. And the Armenian constitution makes reference to Armenian Independence Declaration. And my understanding, those in Turkey who are usually a little bit skeptic about Turkish-Armenian reconciliation, or let's say if one they want to make it harder, they say, oh, Armenia has to change its constitution because the constitution makes reference to Independence Declaration, and Independence Declaration talks about Western Armenia. Western Armenia is today Turkey's east, and this means, you know, they have territorial claims on Turkey. Therefore, we have to see some change. But actually, my understanding is that currently there is talk in Armenia about changing the constitution, if I'm not mistaken. That should be my small comment. But another comment that I would like to make, and I have written it as a journalist in my articles, since you have been talking about and working on Levonter Petrosyan, when I was following Turkish-Armenian relations at that time, I specifically remember the Turkish foreign policy and the Turkish government divided in two. Because there came a moment where Mr. Levonter Petrosyan, he was the president, and Armenia had grabbed a lot of land, Nagorno-Karabakh, but also the rayons, the Azerbaijani territory around Nagorno-Karabakh. And he started to say something like, okay, we might have beaten the Azerbaijanis on the field, but we have to have some kind of a peace, because this victory is only for today. You know, we cannot continue like that, and we have to sit down and talk. And there Ankara was divided into two. Some said, no, we shouldn't give any compromise, we shouldn't support Levonter Petrosyan, they have occupied a lot of Azerbaijani land, etc., etc. Whereas there was another group that said, look, we have to support Levonter Petrosyan. He wants to come back to the negotiating table. We have to make sure that he gets the necessary support. At that time, there was some need for electricity, etc., etc. And the other group was saying, no, no, no, we should push Armenia, we should because there was an embargo as well from Turkey towards Azerbaijan. And the other side was saying, look, if we don't support Levonter Petrosyan, he might lose the elections, and more radical groups and rulers will come, and it will be a waste, an important waste of opportunity for peace. In fact, Turkey has not moved at that time. Mr. Levonter Petrosyan lost, and for a long time, we rather had Nagorno-Karabakh leadership in Armenia, ruling Armenia, and they were rather, from my point of view, more uncompromising. And today, as a journalist, I'm saying maybe we are now living a second Levonter Petrosyan moment, because I think Mr. Pashinyan is a chance for peace, and I believe he has come up with very important changes of position. But having said that, Turkey is still waiting for a final settlement of the Nagorno-Karabakh in order to move on the Turkish-Armenian track. So that gave you enough time to think of another question. Otherwise, I'm going to continue.
I will
Sorry.
make a few comments. Yeah. First, a slight clarification on the question of declarations and whatever. There are two relevant declarations. One is summer of 1990, when the Petrosyan team won the parliamentary election and they became the Supreme Soviet of at that time, still Soviet Union. And there was in the summer a declaration on independence, not of independence, on independence, which said, considering the following, the following principles, we will be going toward independence. The second declaration of independence is just two sentences after the referendum on independence. The sentence said, on the basis of the referendum and the principles involved in the declaration on independence, then we declare independence. And then the 1995, the first constitution, has a preamble.
Yes.
The constitution itself has nothing to do with any Garapal or China or whatever. It specifies that there are 10 marzes or provinces, and Garapal is not included. Garapal Armenians don't vote in Armenian elections, etc., etc. So that was it. Now, what was in the principles of the Declaration on Independence? Because that's where that sentence is. And I think it's point 11 or 13 that says that the Republic of Armenia contributes to efforts toward the genocide recognition that happened in Western Armenia. That's it.
Yes.
That's it. It does not demand anything. It does not, I mean, that's the Armenian intent, is not to make any demands, but to describe in historical terms. I think it would have been good if it said historical Western Armenia. But that the absence of that word created some confusion. That's what we're talking about. So and whether it's justified or not, you know, the Azerbaijani constitution, if I remember right, and Zaur has reference to the First Republic. And the First Republic had claims on Karabakh, Nakhchivan, and Zangezur. It's what?
It never recognized, so it says a claim to the yourself. So there's a difference between Armenian interpretation and Azerbaijan interpretation.
Well, so is with the Armenian. So Pashinyan says there's nothing to do with the constitution, and that reference is not. And then there was also a constitutional court description that said, you know, nothing. So in my mind, I'm not sure whether Azerbaijani, the Turkish objection which appears, is in support of Azerbaijani objection. It's not strict. It's not a Turkish. As I said, the National Security Council resolution does not mention that. So whether, you know, that the demand for constitutional change is actually a very real reason, or some fear, or just an excuse, it's difficult to say for me.
Belki biraz da baş başa sohbetlerle devam eder. Çünkü 1,5 saat oldu. İsterseniz bitirelim burada, eğer ekleyeceğiniz bir şey yoksa, ama ben çok genel bir soruyla bitirmek göremiyorum. Talin. Buyurun.
Talin from the Hrant Dink Foundation. I just had a question about the phases of diplomacy we've been through since 1993. So I think there have been 3 major phases of diplomacy, like the football diplomacy and now the recent one. If there's one key takeaway and one lesson learned from each of these phases, you know, that we can use for future discussions and diplomacy, what would it be?
I'm not sure I understood your question.
So there have been 3 phases of diplomacy. What have we learned? What's the one thing we've learned from this that we can carry going forward?
There's so many things we learn. One is the interpretation of history is very important. And the right lessons from history are very important. That's number one. Number two, that despite the fact that we don't have an agreement or a protocol that is signed between Armenia and Turkey, I think throughout the 30 years, the governments have overall had mature attitudes. That is, no government of Armenia, not of course ours, not Kocharyan, not Ses, not Pashinyan in his worst moments, did not place a precondition. And Turkey's precondition is Karabakh, or the follow-up to the Karabakh issue. I think there is genuine willingness to do this. But the problem was Karabakh, but also for Turkey it's not the most important thing. Turkey has so many other issues. I can summarize this, I think, with my last visit to Ankara when Mesut Yilmaz was Prime Minister for the second time, and I told him, I'm here to ask you a question. How do you want us in Armenia to look at Turkey? As part of our problem or as part of our solution? we're looking at the security of Armenia for the next 20 years, 10 years, 20 years. How do you want us to look at you? That is, are we going to settle this thing and settle history, the historical issue, not the historian's issue, but this relationship, and give Armenia an opening for implementing its different concept of security. This was at first difficult for him to understand. He said, explain, and I explained. So this was a very important, I thought, definition of the problem. We were negotiating at the time the treaty with Russia, 1997, and for example, we were trying to decide, there's a Russian base, would it be there, what would we agree, 10 years, 20 years? And that would depend on Turkey's attitude toward Armenia. If we had an agreement, a protocol normalization, then that would have been 5-10 years at most. But he couldn't do it. I'm not going to go into detail, but he couldn't do it. So it continued. And one thing about the Derbedosyan dissertation, you know, he has a book on Turkish-Armenian relations. Have you seen that? Oh, okay. It's in English. No. So that's one. But it's one thing about Barcan's comment on the second Derbedosyan moment. It's very
Missing the opportunity.
right. That was done with Derbedosyan. That's being done, and this is a conflict in terms of, is it in the interest of Turkey to have normal relations with Armenia? I think the answer has been yes. Otherwise, there would be no negotiations, or you don't even come close to any success. But then those who are the most adamant about normalizing, our administration and Pashinyan, Turkey and Azerbaijan leaders have not done anything to strengthen that position. In fact, by refusing to do this or that, they have strengthened the arguments of the opposition, who say you cannot trust Azerbaijan, they're Turks, you cannot trust Turks, they're Turks, and you cannot rely on them, etc., etc. So there's this paradox in the position where Turkey, for example, I think what I know is that Turkey says, listen, Pashinyan is the best we've had, you know, since Derbedosyan, but what they do nothing to give him some support. And next year there are elections in Armenia. And Pashinyan will not get the majority that he did last time. He may get probably plurality, but not majority. And if it's not majority, then if the others unite against him and bring him down and have another, the other prime minister is not going to be the same as Pashinyan. It's not. It's going to be, it's going to be a very anti-Turkish, fear-based, Russian-supported, Russian-limited foreign policy.
Çok ağır bir son oldu. Çok bu şekilde bitirmeyelim. Acı gerçekler elle diyelim. Daha doğrusu şöyle söyleyeyim. Daha genel bir soruyla ben bitirmek isterim izninizle, hepimiz için diye düşünüyorum. Kitaba da geri dönerek. Doğru soruları sormanın önemini altını sürekli çiziyorsunuz. Belki biz de Türkiye'deki hükümeti harekete geçirebilmek için doğru soruları yaygınlaştırabiliriz diyelim. Ama doğru soruları yanlış sorulardan ayırmakta kullanabileceğimiz kriter nedir? Yani bu soruyu karşı tarafa sorulan sorulardan bahsetmiyorum, kendimize de tarihi ya da politikayı analiz ederken. Soruyu sormadan önce kendimize sorabileceğimiz soru nedir? Bu doğru soru mu diye. .
still beat up on your wife. Is that the right question or the wrong question? It's the wrong question because it assumes that you beat up your wife. The question is whether you still do it or not. You haven't established that he beats up his wife, but you ask that question. Another way, should Armenia have Western orientation or Eastern Russian orientation? Is this a good question? It's not, because it says there's no other choice. What if Armenia has Armenian orientation? You begin not with the assumption that you need to have an orientation, the savior. You don't have that assumption. If you say, I'm going to have Armenian, and then how do I do that? Security, how security concept, foreign policy concepts. And then you may get somewhere. But if I say it's the Russian orientation, it will not get me anywhere. Because we've seen, not only now, but historically, Russian orientation has not done much. Western orientation, the West is just talk. It's just talk. That sometimes has harmed Armenian interests. But we like the Westerners to say good things about us, to give us medals. We love Armenian cuisine. We love Armenian culture, civilization, and whatever. What does that do? What does that do to things Armenian? What did they do when Armenia was in trouble? But Armenians want to believe that that is the question they have to answer. It's the wrong question.
Teşekkürler. Herkese tekrar tek tek çok teşekkür ederiz geldiğiniz için. Hemen ayrılmayacaktır binadan. Belki özel sorularınız ya da daha derin sorularınız varsa kendisini yakalayabilirsiniz fuayede, dışarıda. Teşekkürler. Çevirmenlere çok teşekkür ederiz. Ağzınıza sağlık. İyi akşamlar.